Good evening. I would like to welcome you to yet another exciting Craftsman event. We are competing with some exciting events in the nation, so it will be tough to compete, but hopefully we will be able to do so. I think our event will be even more exciting. As you may know by now, I'm Larres. I'm the holder of the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professorship in History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And unfortunately, I have to say, it is not sunny today. Let me remind you, please, to fill in the mailing list. If you're not yet on the mailing list, I would love to have your email, and I will not pass it on to third parties, but I will inform you of any forthcoming events. Also, I would like to say that our video from last week by Jon Weiser has just been uploaded. So if you go to our YouTube channel, you can watch the event of last week and watch it as often as you like. And of course, I would like to remind you of our website, krasnoevents.com, and all the latest information and the program and the link to the YouTube channel and the photos of our events will be all up there. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome a very distinguished scholar from Duke University here tonight, that is Bruce Jentleson. And Bruce will talk about a very timely topic as well. It is about making peace and keeping peace. We'll talk about peacemakers in the 20th and 21st century. Bruce Jentleson is a professor of public policy and political science at Duke University, and he's a former director of the Stanford School at Duke. He has just published his book on peacemakers, leadership lessons from 20th century statesmanship. And he is, as I said, a very distinguished scholar, and he has also served in government. He was an advisor, a senior advisor to the Director of Policy Planning in 2009-2011. He worked for the Clinton administration. He advised Al Gore on foreign policy during the 2000 presidential election campaign. And he also has worked for Madeleine Albright and advised her on foreign policy issues. And of course, he has been very active with the international media. He's a very active media personality. He gives talks all over the world. Only next week I hear he is going to London to give talks at Chatham House and at the LSE. And he works with think tanks, Brookings and other places. It is therefore very good to have him here today. I'm very pleased that he could make it. We had to postpone his talk because of Hurricane Florence, but now eventually, despite the tough competition today, you're here. I would just like to say that Bruce got his PhD from Cornell University, he got a master's from the LSE, and he has just received the Joseph Corso Memorial Award for Distinguished Public Service from the American Political Science Organization. So we are very pleased to congratulate you on that. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me please join me in welcoming Bruce Jentleson to UNC today.
Thanks very much, Klaus. Really appreciate it. I appreciate all the efforts of you and your team. We did get hurricaned out. I hope everybody here did okay in the hurricane. It was, at least in this area, not as bad as predicted. We were fortunate compared to the rest of the state. And then, of course, we have other events happening today, as we said, which, as many of you know, involve a now quite well-known alumnus of this university, University of North Carolina. But I'm pleased that we can have some conversation about some other issues as we'll go back tonight and watch our television. And by the way, if you do go back and now you recognize the name Jentleson, and if you happen to be an MSNBC watcher, you'll see a young fellow with first name Adam, with last name is my son, who's deeply involved in these issues. And this week has actually had what they call the MSNBC trifecta. He's been on Rachel Maddow, Lawrence O'Donnell, and Chris Hayes, because he's very involved in these issues from his experience working on the Hill. So you might get a double dose tonight, you never know. I'm very pleased. I appreciate the recognition that Klaus gave. Just a word for a second. The award I just received from the American Political Science Association is named for Joseph Purcell, who was a political science professor. We knew each other in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was actually teaching at the University of California at Davis, and he was teaching at Ohio State. And then he went into the Clinton administration as the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Europe, and was working very closely with Richard Holbrooke on the Balkans. And in August 1995, in the mountains outside of Sarajevo, not terrorism, but his vehicle, the road under it collapsed, and he and a career diplomat named Robert Frazier and a military officer were killed. And because he was one of these political scientists who, did some work in the policy arena, the association named an award for him, and it was one of those wonderful recognitions you don't apply for. It was a career award, and when I was accepted it a couple weeks ago in Boston, I was very moved by it, but I also said when you get a career award, it tells you you're no longer a young Turk, right? So it's about a life transition too. So I do want to talk about the theme that comes out of my book, The Peacemakers, Leadership Lessons from 20th Century Statesmanship, and start out with a couple of points, and I'll give you some examples from the book and give you the overview, but really I want to leave time for some questions and discussion. I want to say a couple things at the outset. One is this is not in any way either strictly or even primarily a Trump reactive or Trump centric book. Let me read you a little bit from the preface where I talk about one of the motivating questions for this when I started working on this actually a couple of years ago. I was at the Library of Congress and had the Henry Kissinger chair there, and was able to do a lot of research. As I write in the book, one of the questions motivating is, what can we learn from 20th century statesmanship for the 21st century? For a while in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it seemed like the world was going in a positive direction. The Cold War was ending peacefully, dictatorships were falling to democracy, globalization appeared to be spreading the wealth, history was said to be over, with world affairs so harmonious as to be downright boring. And yet the end of the Cold War has not meant the end of war. U.S. relations with both Russia and China have grown tense and tenuous. That democratic wave has broken up on some rocky shores. Globalization has had losers as well as winners. History has come roaring back, its ancient hatreds fueled by modern venom. Climate change is speeding up, global health pandemics are spreading, cyber and other emerging technologies are in need of rules of the game but aren't getting them. Indeed, it's a lot easier to name a global problem that's been growing worse than one on which progress is being made. This was my thinking even before Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. Excuse me, all along I've intended this book to draw lessons from 20th century statesmanship to help shape and motivate the peace and security breakthroughs our 21st century so crucially needs. Trump, as I come back to in the epilogue, has made this all a little more urgent. Others, such as Vladimir Putin, do as well. In so many ways, we're at one of those crucial moments and turning points that Isaiah Berlin spoke to, in which leaders will determine the next course history takes, for the worse or for the better. Indeed, I start the book with an epigram from Isaiah Berlin, which probably it's never a bad idea to have something by Isaiah Berlin to start the book, in which he wrote, at crucial moments, at turning points, individuals and their decisions can determine the course of history. So as I said, it really was something I'd been thinking about and working on. Arguably has been made more urgent by the state of the world in the last 18 months, but it was something that I would have finished irrespective of Brexit votes, to that, our own election and the like. Second general point is I wrote this really for a broad audience. It's obvious for people who have been professionals in foreign affairs, academics, foreign service and the like, students specializing in it, but it's really for a general audience. There are a number of book clubs that have been adopted. At the launch that we did in New York in April at the Carnegie Council on Ethics and International Affairs, went right up on YouTube. I gave a talk that was on the C-SPAN book world. I'm going to London next week to give a series of talks both for think tanky audiences, and I was actually telling Klaus I'm supposed to speak at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, where I've spoken before, on Tuesday, I think it's the 9th or the 10th of October, and it's a lunchtime talk for their membership. I got a note today from the head of events there saying, can we ask you a favor? We've just found out that we have the opportunity while he's in London, and the only time slot that he can do it is that time slot to host a talk for Vice President Joe Biden. Would you consider moving? Which is a very British understated way, rather than get the heck out of the way, right? And so I said, very kind of you to put it that way. they rescheduled me for that night and said you can come to the Biden talk too. So it was very kind. And I know what they said. They said, no, I insist on giving it. They would have said, tough luck. But, so I'd like to give you an overview of some of the themes really that come out of the book, and then maybe give you a couple examples of cases that I use. In some respects, you can think of this book as a takeoff on John Kennedy's Profiles in Courage, only the figures are global, not just American, and it's about international affairs, not domestic. I'll tell a couple of the stories, but I really want to leave time for any questions or comments you have. So the title of the book, The Peacemakers. My approach to thinking about peace, as I think about it here in the 21st century, and the approach I take in the book is really to break it down into 5 baskets, if you will. One is major power relations, major power geopolitics, which really in every era have been a crucial factor in whether there's war or peace. Secondly, building international institutions, and I focus particularly on the United Nations in the book. Third, advancing freedom and advancing democracy and human rights as another area that's an element of peace. Fourth is what I talk about as the politics of identity, those conflicts in the world that are about who I am, who you are, and why that's a reason for me to kill you before you kill me. And fifth is promoting global sustainability. Probably not a category we would have had in a book 75 years ago, but also a very, very important one as well. In looking at the peacemakers, there's nobody in this book who made a full and perfect peace. It would have been a very thin book, pretty unfortunately. But I really look at stories of people that made major breakthroughs on various aspects of global peace, on issues long thought intractable, beyond the step-by-step of the usual transactional diplomacy to being more transformational. And this, in a sense, gets into the whole theme, which is also in the title of leadership. It's the classic debate of whether leaders make history or history makes leaders. It's been debated, for centuries. It's interesting because when you come out of a grad school program, PhD program in political science, you're actually told that leaders don't matter. It's all about systemic forces, the balance of power, national interest, and the like. And, in the jargon, it's the individual level of analysis. Historians don't do this as much as political scientists at one extreme. At the other extreme, the time I spent inside the Beltway, like everything is about, the Washington Post style page and individuals and leaders. And I think sometimes it gets a little too, too much about, who likes who said what to whom. So I try to define a middle ground here, which I call in the book, I have 2 different terms for it. One I call the 3 C's. Constraints, conducive conditions, and choices. And any leader in the business world, in the higher ed world, in this, civic society world, will face some constraints. And there are situations in which no matter what your personal qualities, the constraints may be so great that it's very hard to make breakthroughs. At the same time, the second C, you may have conducive conditions that help, they don't determine, but help make the conditions on which you can build the changes that you want. But within the constraints and conducive conditions are choices that leaders make. And there's very few situations, sometimes in retrospect we see a major change and we kind of say, oh yeah, of course it happened that way. But if you go back to the moment, you read the papers, or you think of what kind of odds you would have gotten if you went to Las Vegas to bet on one of the cases I talked about is the Kissinger, Zhou Enlai breakthrough in U.S.-China relations, Nelson Mandela, getting out of jail in South Africa and the like. It really has to do a lot with the choices that are made by leaders. The other more kind of fun way I think about it, since I am a die-hard baseball fan, is what I call statesmanship Moneyball. There's been a statistical explosion in all sports, but in baseball you have one statistic that's called wins against replacement play, right? So how many wins did this shortstop contribute to his team compared to every other shortstop in baseball? We call it WAR, wins against replacement. So I talk about SAR, statesman against replacement leader. Would another leader in this situation been able to make the changes and the breakthroughs that this leader made? And I make an argument in the book that everybody in the book gets a high SAR. I played around with statistics for a while. It's kind of silly. And And so I just make the arguments, on the basis of the evidence. James McGregor Burns, who's probably the most acclaimed historian and scholar on leadership, had called it one of the most observed and least understood phenomena on Earth. Walter Isaacson, who's the biographer of Henry Kissinger, Ben Franklin, Albert Einstein, Steve Jobs, Leonardo da Vinci, refers to it as an elusive quality. Do an Amazon search. Last time I did it, I got 191,637 books with the word leadership in it. And the corporate world, over the last 2 decades, spent $14 billion on leadership development programs, yet 75% of the respondents in the study said the programs were ineffective. There's this fascination and frustration with leadership. Fascination because we do know it matters. Frustration because, figuring out what the secret sauce is or what the exact formula is very frustrating. I don't profess to have come up with a secret formula or a special sauce, but I proceed in the book for all the stories I do with what I call a who, why, how, what framework. Who are these people as individuals? And one of these things you see is very few cases are born leaders. Right? There are very few Mozarts or LeBron James, if you will, coming out, from high school with NBA skills. Many of them actually, you wouldn't have predicted they would be the kind of leaders that they were, based on their early life. But nevertheless, there is a personality factor. And the factor I focus on is what I call personal capital. In some cases, it's a moral capital, like in the case of a Mandela. In other cases, it's just the qualities and the prestige a person brings to their position that is beyond the position. And it's a personal capital that helps them with the roles they play as transformational leaders. That's the who that I look at in each case. Why? Why did they make the crucial choices they did? And there, I think, if you think about it, if you're trying to bring about change in any setting, and you want people to follow you, to respond, to not fight you, there's 3 messages you have to be able to convey. One is sort of the analytic message. What's wrong with the present? Why do we need change? The other is the prescriptive message. Where am I going to take you? But the third that's very important is the normative message. Because people, as many social psychologists will tell us, are uncomfortable with change. Change can be scary. And so how do you connect with people in ways in which the change you want doesn't totally fly in the face of values and cultural norms that they're comfortable with? When I had the chapter on Gorbachev and I talked about his great successes, at the end of the day, this was part of his failure. Leadership theorists talk about keeping the opposition close and keeping the temperature under control. And so all of those are really important for the message. What's wrong with the present? What do I propose to change to? And let me help you do this, respecting the fact that people can be frightened by change, even when situations are very bad. The how really gets into political skills. How do they do what they did? We talk a lot about vision. It's nice to have, it's important. But if you don't have the political skills to get from point A to point B, you're not going to bring about particularly transformational change. And the what is the what was and wasn't achieved. And I argue that there's things to be learned from both what was achieved and what wasn't. In the category of statesmen, I obviously include presidents and prime ministers, secretaries of state, foreign ministers, the heads of international institutions. But I also include leaders from NGOs and social movements who did for peace what governments were unable and unwilling to do. And I'll give you a couple examples that flesh that out in a second. Because I think as we think of statesmanship in the 21st century, I'm not of the school that it's all about networks and NGOs. States really matter. Leaders really matter in official positions. But I think we see forces of change that come from civil society and from other places, more so now than in past periods. And in the lessons, the preface I read you kind of gets at that. The goal of the book is not only to review the history of the 20th century, but to draw out lessons for the 21st century. And I don't point to this or that individual, because as I said, some of the people that are the statesmen in my book would not have been pointed to earlier in the career. But I do talk about strategies, both in each of these 5 areas and across the board for being a peacemaker. And publishers can be very clever. What they do is they shade the page, and at the end of each of the 5 sections, the gray shaded pages are, okay, wise guy, now tell these stories, what are the lessons of the 21st century? And so that's kind of how it's set up. Who are the profiles? I make a couple of caveats, one of which is that it's a representative sample. In fact, the fun has been, a couple of book clubs have been saying, let's have everybody read it and say who we put in this book. And there are a couple of people I left out that you may ask me about, and I had some fights with my publisher because of length, that we had to leave a few people out that I wanted. But it's a representative sample, not definitive, and the like. And as you'll see, I really talk about people for particular peacemaking roles, not their overall foreign policy. They're not necessarily perfect people, and the like. And none of this is to go to that side of the leaders make history debate that it's all about the individual. It's a mix of those constraints, conducive conditions, and choices, and other people come into play. So I have two chapters in the major power geopolitics section. One is on Kissinger and Zhou Enlai in the 1971 U.S.-China opening, more those two than Nixon and Mao, for reasons I'll come back to in a second. Second is on Gorbachev. Reagan comes into the chapter, perhaps more than some other liberal scholars would do, and maybe less than some conservative scholars do, but Reagan, John Paul, a lot of others come in the chapter, but Gorbachev is my statesman against replacement leader. In the second section of Building International Institutions, I actually start with Woodrow Wilson and actually talk about why he failed to a great extent, which is things I actually learned from. It wasn't just this wave of isolation of the United States that had a lot to do with his arrogance and a number of other factors that I'm just going to mention that and we can come back to. Franklin Roosevelt for the design of the United Nations. And one of the stories I'll tell a little bit about is Dag Hammarskjöld. In my mind, really the only Secretary General who's ever really, effectively made the United Nations work as an institution, and did it in ways that carry lessons for the 21st century. The third section on reconciling politics of identity starts with Mandela, the iconic figure. Has a chapter on Yitzhak Rabin, which I call Soldier's Peacemaker, which talks about where he succeeded and ultimately where he failed, but part of what led to his assassination. And then has a chapter to get to the civil society level, and this is one I'll come back to too. I'm going to try to give you a sampling. Two Northern Irish women in the early 1970s, Mary Corrigan and Betty Williams, who led a movement that started to break the back of the violence, that didn't totally resolve the conflict, but sort of show what can happen from below. In the freedom and human rights section, I start with Gandhi. I said basically there are three main issues in the 20th century involving freedom and human rights. One was anti-colonialism, and I use Gandhi as an example of that. Second was throwing off Soviet communism. And there I originally had Lech Walesa and Václav Havel, and I was told, choose one. It'll get too long, we got to price it too high, so we went with Walesa. Third one, I want to, which may be more controversial one, which is really about military dictatorships. I have a chapter on Aung San Suu Kyi that I want to say something else about. And the fourth one is on the British lawyer, guy named Peter Benenson, who started Amnesty International in 1961. He's actually kicked out of the organization 6 years later, but really launched the contemporary human rights movement. And so those were the issues I felt were crucial issues in the 20th century on those. The Aung San Suu Kyi chapter was a very problematic one for reasons that I think are no surprise. I started this chapter on the basis of her role from the late 1980s on in helping bring at least the transition to partial democracy. And then as we were finishing up the book in the summer of 2017, the Rohingya genocide was happening, in which she was at minimum complicit. As Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, wrote, soon the world will witness a remarkable sight, a beloved Nobel Peace Prize winner presiding over 21st century concentration camp. So I talked to my editor in New York and said, we got to pull the chapter. And he said, well, let's talk about this. He said, all your other chapters are about where people succeeded and where they didn't succeed and what their strengths were and not. In fact, every other chapter in this section, Gandhi's was about anti-colonialism. Even had he not been assassinated, nobody would have ever thought Gandhi was the kind of person who would be prime minister. Walesa was played an extraordinary role in the Polish Revolution. He was a terrible president when he got to be president. Peter Bennett, as I said, starting Amnesty International, gets kicked out. So there is an interesting pattern. Those who move change are not the ones to consolidate and institutionalize it. So we told the chapter as a cautionary tale, and we try to talk about both aspects. And as we say in the chapter, does the most recent events annul the role that she played in the 1988-2015 period to lead the restoration of democracy in Myanmar? How can she be included in a book about peacemakers? These are tough questions, heartfelt concerns, and I've wrestled with them. As with other profiles, lessons need to be drawn from what was and wasn't worthy in the leader's record, as well as what was and wasn't achieved. With contrasts as stark as these, the Aung San Suu Kyi profile serves an especially cautionary tale. So that's the role it plays, in the book. I also said that none of these people are perfect people. Mandela's biography, he was alienated from his own children, partly because of being a prisoner, but also for some things in his personal life. Gandhi had some, shall we say, unusual personal practices when it was to demonstrate his sexual asceticism. Franklin Roosevelt had his affairs, etc. So to break the notion that you need to be a perfect person. I don't think I opened it up to the point of saying anything goes in your personal life, but I tried to break that notion. So let me just take a couple examples to show you, sort of the arguments I make and also how it bears upon 21st century. So let me start with the Kissinger, Zhou Enlai U.S.-China Open. I got to interview Kissinger in this was the winter of 2015, the winter of 2016. He's in his 90s. One would never say he's an advertisement for health clubs, but still pretty vigorous, both physically and mentally. We had a long interview, at the end of which, of course, he said he'd give me more time, and he said, very Kissinger, he said, I really have to leave now because I need a briefing, I'm going to Russia. And I said, oh, are you going to meet Putin? And he said, I usually do. Silly question to ask. But I tell this story, with a couple of points. First, I tell it notwithstanding other criticism of Kissinger's foreign policy, Vietnam, Chile, or Zhou Enlai and China's repression. Second, there were some conducive conditions. We had the superpower triangle, if you remember. But it's useful to remember how we used to think about Red China. And at the beginning of the chapter, I go back to a broadcast on CBS News called The Face of Red China that was hosted by Walter Cronkite, in which not he, but the correspondent really talked about how China was much worse than the Soviet Union. The most terrifying thing is not the physical regimentation, but the regimentation of men's minds. When these people are not pounding the earth, their minds are being pounded with the slogans of communism, at least an hour of indoctrination a day and communal nurseries in the life. There's probably a degree of racism in our view of China, that whatever we thought about the Soviet Union, we didn't have that. So again, if you had bet on the odds of this working, while there were some conducive conditions, probably would have bet against it. Nixon and Mao get a lot of credit for the politics. They got the opera. Kissinger and Zhou Enlai really did the statesmanship, and the statesmanship was quite extraordinary. On the first secret trip, they had 17 hours of meetings, a few with aides, but mostly one-on-one with translators. In the second secret trip, 4 days, 10 meetings, 23 hours and 40 minutes, and I've read most of the transcripts. Most of it's been declassified. Compare that to today's scripted meetings, talking points. In fact, I say this for presidents I work for. I work for President Obama. You go into meetings with Secretary of State Clinton. And there's something about that I think really stands in the way of making progress on relationships. And whatever else is happening in U.S.-China relations today in this recent Thucydides mania, the reality is for almost a half century the basic framework worked out has held up. We've had our differences, but the relationship has bent a little bit, but it's never broken. There are a couple interesting stories that come through when you do this. One was the story of the handshake. I'd seen in the documents, it said when they first met, Kissinger walks in the room and he puts out his hand to shake Zhou Enlai's hand. And when you do these interviews, I'm sure Klaus would say the same thing, you don't really say, exactly what did you say in the second hour of the meeting, 45 years ago. But you look for the color, and I asked him about this, and he said it was very interesting. He said, credited the China specialist on his staff. In 1955, at the Geneva Conference dividing up Vietnam after French colonialism, John Foster Dulles was there, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, and Zhou Enlai. And Dulles, the Cold War hawk, shook hands with Molotov. He refused to shake hands with Zhou Enlai, the whole red China. And so Kissinger's staff had said, you know, this would be very important. So he puts his hand out, shakes, and as they got to know each other, Zhou Enlai says, you have no idea how important that was. It demonstrated respect, and it helped create a context in which we could disagree within a relationship that had a degree of personal trust. And I think when you think about diplomacy, and I think many people in this room, I'm guessing, because I know that's my experience talking here before, are retired diplomats. They joked around a lot in the meetings. James Reston, the eminent New York Times columnist of the day, happened to be in China at the same time Kissinger was there in July 1971 and was in, I think, Shanghai, and was about to come to Beijing. And Kissinger was concerned that if he arrived while Kissinger was there, word would get out. So Zhou Enlai sent a message to the local party officials in Shanghai and to delay James Reston's trip. And Kissinger said to Zhou Enlai, he says, you know, if he comes here and finds out what we talked about, I'll have to ask for a job in your foreign ministry. The transcript notes considerable laughter on the Chinese side. On the diplomacy, and this really gets to the notion of statesmanship, there are a couple keys to the breakthroughs in my argument. One of the most important is they made the transactional serve the transformation. Often in diplomacy, the latter is dependent on the former. What are your asks? What are your deliverables? And somehow this notion, if we can agree on particularly in an adversarial relationship, if we can agree on 4 or 5 things, then the sum of those will be greater than the parts. And in fact, what they really saw is that the transactional gets more resolvable if you can start to begin to work on the transformation. You begin to have trust, you begin to have a strategic shared view of where the relationship can go. And Zhou Enlai, in one of the meetings, put it, as he put it, only the settlement of fundamental questions first can lead to the settlement of other questions. Very interesting concept as you think about it, and I'm going to take this to a current event in just a second. So on Vietnam, the United States went in basically wanting the Chinese to sit on the North Vietnamese, pressure them to end the war. What the Chinese agreed to was to reduce their aid, reduce their support, but not bring a lot of pressure. They compromised on that. Excuse me, on Taiwan, the Chinese very much wanted us to fully sever the relationship. We did not. It took another 7 years to normalize relations, and they compromised on that. And so you had compromises on the crucial transactional elements that really were because you began to define the transformation. And a lot of this comes through their discussions. There's one great one that I happen to like, since I grew up on Long Island outside of New York City, in which Zhou Enlai tried to explain to Kissinger the importance of Taiwan. He says, it's been a part of China longer than Long Island's been a part of the United States, you know. So the dialogue was both at an intellectual level and at a pragmatic level. At the end of the day, 3 things were crucial to the breakthrough: the personal, the policy, and the political. The personal relationships cultivated, the trust and the respect, the collegiality that they developed. The policy that they strategized, they tried to find the common ground on crucial issues like Taiwan and Vietnam. And the politics was managed. This is where Nixon and Mao were really key in terms of managing the politics. I'm not going to do it now, in the interest of time, I have to go back to it, the Gorbachev story in similar ways. But let me take you to the present. I was asked to write a column for foreignpolicy.com a couple days before the Trump Kim Jong-un Singapore summit. And I said, the 3 keys to breakthroughs are the personal, policy, and the political. Political, actually, these guys probably can manage. Right? Trump could do a proverbial Nixon goes to China, coming back to American politics. And as far as we know, Kim Jong-un runs North Korean politics. The personal, again, look what, Gorbachev and Reagan developed this great relationship over 3 summits and extraordinary interaction. Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, the notion that these 2 individuals are going to walk in a room and develop a kind of personal relationship in what, 2, 3, 4 hours, not to mention the clash of their personalities. Trump is not exactly known for showing respect to people on the other side, and Kim Jong-un had very little experience dealing with other international leaders, and so I worry that it's just not going to happen. And the policy, as we saw, we had a fundamental disagreement on issues like, does the commitment to denuclearize come first, or is it the end product of building the relationship? The transformational part, ending the Korean War, finding some common ground. And so my sense is that the summit actually fit that model. But it's a useful model to think about in these adversarial relations, the personal, policy, and the political. Let me skip ahead quickly to the Dag Hammarskjöld story. The title of that chapter is The Secular Pope, which was an expression used to describe him at the time, that he had this authority and credibility, this personal capital as the head of the United Nations on a universal basis. When he became Secretary General in 1953, his predecessor called the job the most impossible job in the world. The memos back in Washington was that he's just your average Swedish bureaucrat. Yet he really was enormously effective. And I'll just quickly tell two of the examples I use in the book. One is also sort of a small thing that isn't as well known. But at the end of the Korean War, when there was questions about the exchange of prisoners of war, there were also two prisoners, American prisoners that China had taken, that they were going to try as war criminals rather than go through the Geneva processes and the like. So the beginning of it was a crisis between the United States and China in ways you can imagine. This is still, period of McCarthyism here. And they were facing life sentences based on Chinese military tribunal convictions for espionage. And tensions were running high over the Taiwan Straits crisis. So here's this untested Secretary General who says, let me take a shot at it. His very first foreign trip ever was to Peking, to Beijing. And he works the diplomacy. And he works the diplomacy, in fact, in ways that John Foster Dulles back in Washington is not happy about. He really doesn't want to see this resolved. In some ways, he's looking for a reason. And it goes back and forth, and Hammarskjöld goes back to Sweden for his 50th birthday, and he's vacationing with friends on the Swedish coast, and he gets a message from the Chinese embassy in Stockholm wishing him a happy birthday, asking what gift he might like to receive. Release of the American prisoners, he responded, sincerely, even if a tad facetiously. 3 days later, a cable arrived from the Swedish ambassador to China, transmitting a message from Zhou Enlai. The Chinese government has decided to release the imprisoned U.S. flyers. This release from serving their full term takes place in order to maintain friendship with Hammarskjöld and has no connection to the UN resolution which the U.S. had pushed through. Zhou Enlai expresses hope that Hammarskjöld will take note of this point and congratulates Hammarskjöld on his 50th birthday. Very important, the crisis averted. What would have happened if it don't happen, we don't know, but we can venture a guess. The other story I tell is the Suez crisis, which, if you remember, had two permanent members of the UN Security Council who invaded another Security Council, Britain and France, along with Israel, and pulled together four crucial issues of the day: anti-colonialism, the Middle East conflict, the Cold War, and sort of third world nationalism. Long story. Hammarskjöld basically jumps into this, negotiates the agreement that leads to the pullout of British and French and Israeli troops. Actually, along with Lester Pearson, the Canadian ambassador, creates the very first peacekeeping force, which became the Sinai Force, and really invents peacekeeping. And by the way, he's doing this while he's also trying to manage the crisis over the Soviet invasion of Hungary. These are happening at the same time. And again, there's a longer story about, I'm happy to bring more details about the diplomacy he brings to the table. We allowed the Secretary General to play a role. You fast forward to the current situation and you look at the role that the UN has not been allowed to play in a crisis like Syria. Okay. Back during the Obama administration, when we called the Geneva Conference, and Secretary General Ban Ki-moon invited Iran to come, since they are a party to the conflict. The United States, under the Obama administration, pressured them to disinvite Iran. I actually worked on some of the back-channel diplomacy in Syria 2015-16 when I was out of government, but coordinating with three colleagues messages that the Obama administration wanted to send back and forth to some of the parties, and we worked with Staffan de Mistura, the UN, special representative, and he had no power. And so the contrast, in those things, and I make an argument in the book that we really need a strong Secretary General. That if you're a major power, you might lose a little bit in your prerogatives. But what you gain on precisely those issues that cause more problems for you, in many ways, more than in other parts of the world, like Syria, and the effects it's had on Europe in terms of the migration, the effects it's had on the Syrian people, its continuing possibility to set off a total Middle East regional war. You may lose this in terms of your prerogatives, but you gain this in terms of your policy goals. And I talk about the politics of it. I'm very aware of the politics. And I say if politics as usual prevails, none of this will happen. The UN will continue to be largely ineffectual. There'll be more deadly conflicts like Syria and the like, and I go on from there. It won't fix all the problems of the UN, but if we allow the Secretary General to be a statesman of the Charter, to revitalize the international civil service, which, by the way, is not just an issue for the United States and Russia and China, but for all these other countries that want their quotas. We need the UN to do what only the UN can do. And I can't think of any major institution or organization that has ever done that without having an effective, if you will, CEO. So there are a lot of lessons from Hammarskjöld. I always wrestle with the notion, having spent a lot of time watching, well, that's a really great idea, but it's not politically realistic. And then you say, well, okay, everything else you're talking about is not policy realistic. So which one's going to bend? And I think that, sometimes you have to make the politics bend. And a lot of what I'm saying in the book is not that I expect this administration to do it. It's really to try to make arguments about what needs to be done and get us thinking and working on that. The last one I'll use as an example is the Northern Irish women, because it's really kind of an interesting and very different story. So this is the late 1960s, early 1970s, and the Catholic-Protestant conflict was going through the period that came to be known as the Troubles. The death toll had gone up from 16 in 1969 to 479 in 1972. And around that time, there's an incident in which a woman is out in Belfast with her 3 children, one's a baby in a carriage, taking a walk, and an IRA getaway car being chased by British police runs out of control, kills 2 of the kids, seriously injures the woman and the baby. Her sister, who's a secretary in a Guinness brewery by the name of Mary Corrigan, rushes to the hospital and comes out, and there are all these BBC cameras and microphones. And she makes a statement to the effect of, this has got to stop, only 5% of the people in this country really want this kind of violence to happen. And as we would say today, it went viral. No internet. The BBC reporter, actually a fairly seasoned reporter who'd been covering these things, breaks into tears. And it just went viral. It was one of those things, woman and moment, if you will, in which it just happened in a moment. Betty Williams, the other person in the story, both of them eventually win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1977, joins it. They form a movement called the Northern Ireland Women for Peace. They begin to have demonstrations all over Northern Ireland where the Catholic and the Protestant communities will meet and come together. There's big concerts in Hyde Park in London with all sorts of performers, Joan Baez and the like, and they get the endorsements of celebrities. They don't solve the conflict. It takes another 20 plus years till 1998, the Good Friday Agreement, negotiated part by Ambassador George Mitchell and leaders of, political diplomatic leaders of the 2 sides. But it broke the cycle of violence. From 1971 to 1976, in that period, there were 1,752 deaths in Northern Ireland. For the entire period, that's 6 years, for the entire 22-year period that followed, 77 to 98, there's 1,689 deaths. And so I use this as an example, not to overstate it, where sort of the breakthrough really came from average people. Mary Corrigan and Betty Williams actually get pushed aside out of the movement after a number of years. Kind of a similar story. They don't really have the political skills to take it to the next step, but they fulfilled their role in really launching it. And there were some things that, whether or not they spent the Nobel Prize money on some personal stuff and the like. At the end of each of these sections, and at the end, I try to draw it all together. The global sustainability section basically says, we're used to the term WMD, weapons of mass destruction. But if you look at the rather scary projections and models for climate change, we look at EMD, environmental mass destruction, and as I think we know, not just someday in the future, but here and now. And if you look at some of the models for global pandemics, we're looking at DMD, diseases of mass destruction. So when you talk about global sustainability, no matter how you slice it, you're not just talking about the quality of life, you're talking about the same kinds of things in many respects we talk about in war and peace issues. The profiles I have there, one is on Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the Prime Minister of Norway, but it was more for the role she played internationally in the late 80s, chairing a commission on sustainable development that first developed the concept of sustainable development, getting out of the zero-sum economy and environment, and then was head of the World Health Organization and engineered a lot of reforms. And then I used the Gates Foundation, which also has its critics about what I call philanthropy statesmanship. The Gates Foundation has the second largest budget next to the World Health Organization for global health. And so I really tried there too to open it up. And I make various recommendations I'm happy to go into, but I want to stop and open it up to you. The conclusion I draw at the end is fairly straightforward. It is that being a peacemaker is difficult. We have Rabin, we have Gandhi who get assassinated, we have Gorbachev who basically politically gets assassinated. It's possible. Well, virtually every one of these stories are ones in which we didn't see the breakthrough coming. And it didn't solve all our problems. We've had backlash and backsliding. But even, I'm not of the school that we're in a new Cold War with the Russians. It's not global. It's not the edge of nuclear war, and it's not ideological. We've got serious major power issues, as well as a few other things. But we've been in a lot worse shape if the Cold War hadn't ended. So it's possible. And as you look at the 21st century, it's necessary. We are not going to get to where we need to get on any one of these sets of issues strictly through incremental change and transactional diplomacy. In the same way that we had breakthroughs in crucial things in the 20th century, we really need it in the 21st. So that's the gist. The joke was I actually thought about never finishing the book because with all the work I was doing at the same time on things like Syria, this actually was good for my mental health because it was somewhat positive. But I did manage to finish it and really try to use it as a way that tracks beyond the immediate issues of the day to think about what the great challenges are for all of us in the 21st century world. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You certainly gave us a lot of food for thought. Let me ask you, when writing such a book and dealing with a number of very different people, which persons did you find most fascinated? Which people did you think, God, what a bore?
I have to say for the most fascinating, and some of it was the chapter on Rabin, because when I was in the State Department 93 to 94, 95, I was involved in the Middle East peace talks. And I still remember the Oslo day, the White House, and I remember the day before where I was working. My boss was Ambassador Sam Lewis. Some of you may know Sam. Sam was one of the great diplomats of his generation. And he had been U.S. Ambassador to Israel during Camp David, Carter, Begin, Sadat, and he was also U.S. Ambassador to Israel during the Lebanon War of 1982. And we actually didn't know what was happening in that hunting lodge. We really didn't. Fully, we kind of knew something was going on, but they did a really good job of keeping it quiet. And it was starting to come to us, and Sam calls me, he says, come into my office. And he takes these two pieces of paper off a fax machine, right? Remember what that was, okay? And he says, we handle a lot of pieces of paper every day. But these are historic, and what it was, along with the details of the Declaration of Principles, was the exchange of letters between Prime Minister Rabin recognizing the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and Arafat's letter recognizing Israel's right to exist. And I stayed involved in the issue even when I've been out of government. Happened to be in Israel in 1995, right after Rabin's assassination, for some, just more outside of government work. And I remember going down to the square where he was assassinated, it's like a couple weeks after. And I knew why my friends and colleagues were broken up. But what I saw down there were 16-year-old kids with flowers and candles and guitars. And Rabin wasn't exactly what a consultant would say, telegenic or John Kennedy charisma, but he had touched these people. And I make a strong argument in there, we go into why I believe that the peace process would have succeeded had he not been assassinated, and how much better off both sides would have been. So personally, that one really was interesting. I think from a strict diplomacy point of view, the Kissinger-Joe Larres story is absolutely fascinating. Nobody was a bore. I mean, there are odd ducks. You know, the guy who starts Amnesty International is kind of a weird character. Aung San Suu Kyi is an unusual character, you know, so it's not somebody you kind of want to hug. But I think because of what they did, I didn't find any of the stories boring.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Another question, how important are personalities in politics? The old question, what is more important, structure and the waves and long-term waves of history or personalities? When we think about Nixon and Kissinger, Nixon had the idea, one has to admit. He was the thinker behind the opening to China. And then, of course, he sent his trusted confidant, Kissinger, to Beijing to explore it all. If he had sent his Secretary of State, William Rogers, maybe there wouldn't have been as much laughter, but would the outcome have been very different?
I don't think so. That's where I think when you look at the documents and you trace the difficulties that they had of doing the diplomacy in these meetings, you know, two crucial issues, Vietnam and Taiwan, finding common ground, coming out of this red China mentality, separate from the politics. And it was very, I believe both parties were very, very skilled in that respect. On the personality, so on the one hand, personality in some cases can be very determinative, and the example I'll cite is Woodrow Wilson. So, Confessions of a Professor. For years I taught the failure of the League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles, as the American public, after World War I, retreated into isolationism, and there was this wave of isolationism, and oh, poor Woodrow Wilson. But when you dig into both the biographies and the documents, you see, first of all, Wilson was an incredibly arrogant guy. I mean, I know a lot of professors would believe to be arrogant, and somebody who was president of Princeton at a very young age. But even some of the stories about him at Princeton, like he broke up with friends when they wouldn't totally agree with him. He was always right. And he had deals on the Treaty of Versailles where he could have had coalitions separate from the Henry Cabot Lodges to make it pass with a very viable treaty, with a little bit of compromise, but not, taking away, not stripping the League of Nations. He would not do it. He would not do it. And then he gets ill. That is an example where personality was very powerful. But the rest of it, you see, Gorbachev was an apparatchik coming up. He has the intellect to see the system's weaknesses. Zhou Enlai, China wasn't as bad as Mao, was part of much of the repression. Mandela in 1962 or 64, when Amnesty International was first starting, they refused to adopt him as a political prisoner because he was part of the violence movement. So you see evolution in people. So I actually really come down more on the side of there's some qualities that can develop over time by experience. The FDR story to me has always had a lot to do with polio in Warm Springs, that took him out of the Hudson Valley elite and exposed him to other weaknesses, and really I think had some historians say he might have had a second-class mind, which I don't agree with, but he had a first-class temperament.
Mm-hmm. What about Donald Trump?
So, as I said, it's not, look, I do a lot of talking to journalists, and I feel, again, I work for Democrats, I chaired one of Hillary Clinton's foreign policy committees, they're a little truth in advertising. But I deeply believe that analytically, not just in a partisan way, that while there have been other presidents that I've disagreed with, I disagreed with Ronald Reagan, I disagreed with a tremendous amount of George W. Bush, there's never been a president that I thought was dangerous to the country and the world. And if you read Bob Woodward's book, which I've been doing lately, I don't know why, but talk about self-torture. The thing that comes through is the emotional instability of this person. And I made an argument before the North Korea summit that I was actually worried that if the summit failed, that he would go back to the Rocket Man, and because he felt that it failed, he might go back to that. That hasn't happened yet. I really believe temperament is a lot of things, and everything you see about, the notion that the staff has to manage the temperament and tell somebody something in a certain way so they don't yell at you, separate from his policies, to me, that's the crucial element that I can do the proverbial. I've got 3 grandchildren now that makes me worry about their future.
Thanks very much. Let's open it up. Any questions here? Yes, please.
I'm wondering whether you see any manifestations of, I'll call, bounded rationality of the human mind, things that move so fast and in such a large scale or high complexity, mediated by the internet, by computation, by high finance, by global warming and the like, that they are actually beyond individuals.
Let me read you a quick passage that relates to that point a little bit, and I'll come back to it. And you can tell me who wrote this and when, if you can guess. For our everyday life is becoming so saturated with the tremendous power of mass communications. Our political life is becoming so expensive, so mechanized, and so dominated by professional politicians and public relations men that the idealist who dreams of independent statesmanship is rudely awakened by the necessities of election and accomplishment. If you want to venture a guess, the year this was written in person. So its profiles encouraged 1956. Okay? And with my students, I do, because folks, people sense of history, and there's a lot of things, how much has changed with social media, and it has. But we go through a certain amount of woe is usism, right? Where our challenges today are unquestionably complicated by the kind of things you're talking about. But in one of my classes the other day, I showed the picture in 1852 of Senator Sumner being beaten up on the floor of the Senate, with a cane, almost killed because of the Civil War. A lot of stuff happened today. That hasn't happened, So I feel like we have to, yes, it's a classic thing where you recognize what are the unique aspects of the challenges you face, and one of those in which there's similar to things happened in the past and maybe you can learn from. I don't think we're at that stage because I also think that some things are fairly, core ideas, as they say, make things simple but not simplistic, remain to be there. And then you can turn that technology. We went through a period where we thought, like in the Arab Spring, the Facebook revolution, the Twitter revolution, and there was a lot of silly stuff, including in the administration I was serving in, people were a little tech inebriated, that, this was all going to make, revolution possible. Well, as we know, repressive forces can use technology too. So how do you use those technologies in a positive way? Scientists are telling us all sorts of things we can do to both, lower temperatures on climate change and do some mitigation and some adaptation. Scientists are telling us and doctors what we need to do to prevent pandemics from spreading. I do believe that the U.S.-Russia and U.S.-China relations can be managed. I really do. I think that, I've been making an argument I make in the book that I think, and I've seen some of this in some of the dealings I've had. I think Putin's reaching a point of diminishing returns on his strategy home. To the extent that polls come out, the same things that got him elected, or got him chosen, and why people liked him over Yeltsin, the economy, are starting to hurt. It's always more significant than the Pussy Riots protests or when truck drivers around Moscow, protests around the Moscow Beltway. They've made their point that they are a major power and that nothing can be resolved, Syria, Ukraine, without them. Russians are dying. This plane got shut down mistakenly by the other days. So that gets into another issue. But I feel like there's things to work with. I know there I don't think Trump is going to do it for a whole lot of reasons. But it's just to answer your point. I don't think that those kind of things we have today are insurmountable, because we have the counter thing is the experience, technology, knowledge to try to work with those forces.
Thank you. What is kind of obvious or increasingly obvious is that both Moscow and Beijing are trying to divide the West by approaching the Europeans, trying to work with the Europeans, because the Americans do not want to work with them. And I think that strategy is probably going to increase if the situation continues as it is at the moment.
I think so. I actually read some of my writing, except from the book. I wrote a piece in the spring in a journal called Democracy, Journal of Ideas, called The Liberal Order Isn't Coming Back, so what's next? I actually don't think. I actually think, and the argument in there is that the liberal order, to think about Trump as effect, not just cause. The economic issues, think of Brexit as effect, not just cause. These have been building for really the first vote in the United States in the U.S. Congress in which labor was against the trade bill was 1974. So they built up over time. And then they got tapped by some demagogic leaders. International institutions, for all those believing, have been underperforming. UN and others. The democratic model has been under lots of stress. So I actually think we're coming to a different era. That's not, going back, if we could just, go back to the way things were pre-Trump. And I think it's very confusing and interesting that the dynamics of the 21st century, if we have international order, are going to be very different. And if you think about it, it's like the Fukuyama argument of the end of history ended up not working, because why would you think that the contestation of ideas that had gone out throughout history somehow was over and was settled on democracy and capitalism? The same thing to me about the liberal international order. It was created in 1945 because of a particular distribution of power, set of challenges, threats, and it worked reasonably well for that. But why would the same array of international institutions and power work 70 years later when power is distributed differently, the actors are different? You know what I mean? It's almost like you don't throw it out, totally. But that's where I think some of the, and for me, frankly, I think, there's a part of me that gets on Twitter every day and says everything's wrong with Donald Trump, and we need NATO and all this sort of thing. But there's a deeper level as we think about what is the alternative to America first, both as academics, but also as think tank people. Think of a 2020 election, what is the concept you run on, even in a political context, as an alternative candidate? I don't know the answer, but I think they're really interesting questions.
So are you saying that Donald Trump is speeding it up, but it would have happened without him?
I think if Hillary Clinton had won, he's made it worse. That's why he's caused. I think if Hillary Clinton had won, if Brexit had been defeated, I think many of these forces feeding what we've come to call populism, this mix of cultural anxiety, economic dislocation, and a certain amount of fear from domestic or terrorism coming to the Western homelands. I think those things were all there. I think they wouldn't have been as bad as they've become in the last 18 months, but that's why a guy like Trump could mobilize it. That's why you had in England, areas that get more money from the EU than they give in, we're convinced. And I was at Oxford a few years ago, living there for about 6 months, and people then were talking about the Polish plumber, right? So it's not the Syrian refugees in the UK. It is in Germany and in Italy, because they're not reaching, or the North African. It was the whole notion of the Polish plumber, which was a certain amount of prejudice against the Slavs. So I do think that it would have been, and we had some discussions with some of the people involved in the Clinton campaign, saying, guys, I know we were giving these speeches, but if we win, it's not going to be enough to say we believe in the liberal order and we believe in human rights. We're going to have to really think about strategy.
Thank you. The English definitely need the Polish plumber, actually.
That's right. That's right.
Without the Poles, no plumbers in England, I can tell you. Yes, please.
Well, it strikes me listening to you and these very esteemed figures, the peacemakers of the 20th century, how far we have fallen, because I don't see anybody in the 21st century in the West that comes anywhere. Instead, we have a lot of dwarfs. And I think actually the corruption of our leadership of this country began with the Clintons, and that Bill Clinton was an extremely flawed figure. It was because of, I heard a very esteemed figure who we were fortunate to have in government just a year ago at Dartmouth, William J. Perry, as our very esteemed Secretary of Defense. And he spoke again, as he has written in his book on the nuclear situation, that it was Richard Holbrooke who got the attention of Clinton, that Perry pulled one way to not push NATO into Eastern Europe, not to, because many people are convinced that we really promised. I mean, when the negotiations of Reagan, Gorbachev, Jack Matlock, your colleague at Duke, that worked very hard to bring that collapse of the Soviet Union and to get an understanding with
Sure.
the Russians.
You have a question,
And then
yeah?
it fell apart. But I don't see,
So, yeah, one is on the dwarfs. Again, you can go back to many of the people in the book. You know, Rabin in 1987, in the first Intifada, talked about breaking knuckles. Okay, he came to see, in one of his famous quotes, that there was no guarantee peace would make Israel secure, but there was no way Israel would ever be secure without peace. So if you look at 1987, you see Rabin a peacemaker? No way. Nelson Mandela was part of a violent movement when he first started out and evolved. Gorbachev was a regional apparatchik. So I don't think it's necessarily that we don't have the people. Okay, that's why I don't point in the book to this person or that person. I think many of the people in the book, as you come out, in a very, same thing Roosevelt, really changed a lot over the course of his life. FDR and Hammarskjöld, Swedish bureaucrat. But that doesn't worry me that much. Okay, people can evolve, they can step up to the challenges. On your point about NATO and the mistakes that were made, there's a lot of debate about that, and I don't totally disagree with you. But I do push back on my Russian friends when they wheel that out, a quarter century later, as the overall justification for why they invaded Ukraine and things like that. I feel like, and that's not what you're doing, but I think they get to overuse it. We got it. I had colleagues in Washington in the 90s who were very disrespectful to Russia. They're saying, it's a large gas station that has nuclear weapons, right? And it was like, this is a great power historically, and we made a huge number of mistakes in the way we dealt with it. Clinton did, George W. Bush did, Obama did, clearly Trump did. So I do think that, but and again, it's leaders emerge, and I'm not very much of a Pollyanna. I am from New York and have that cynicism deeply ingrained in me, but I don't feel like it's necessary, like, who's out there right now. It's the interaction between person and moment.
Thank you very much.
can I say one more thing, in that I think that the leadership or failure of leadership is the embodiment of the motion of history and the other courses, and I'm saying that because I think we are very deeply corrupted, particularly in this country and in the West.
Thank you very much for this very optimistic assessment. Here, can you hear this gentleman over here?
Thanks, Bruce. Great research topic, and what I've seen in the book so far, very good. It seems to me, though, in your most recent answers here, you're really coming down on the history makes the man side of things. I mean, you said that the leaders are out there, they will emerge, but what makes them emerge, right? I mean, ultimately, you're bringing individualism or personality or leadership into a structural explanation, but it seems like you still have that structural bias behind you there. Is that right?
It's the 3 C's. It's no question that history creates a mix of constraints and conducive conditions. Gorbachev had any number of choices. They may not have worked. He could have cracked down on Eastern Europe like had been done in '56 and '68 and other times. He didn't make those choices, and there were a number of other individuals that were, pressing him to do that. So I don't know that it. I steer away from the, the Thomas Carlyle heroic conception of history as if it's all about the great man or woman that emerges, but I don't think that that's the way it is. It is the interaction. But you have a set of conditions, and then what you need to add to the mix is the kind of leadership that brings that mix of vision, personal capital, and political skills to it. So it's kind of it's interactive, I think, in my view. Not just structural forces determine or individuals strictly determine.
So I guess my follow-up to that would be, where do the individuals come from?
From a variety of areas. I mean, the examples I was giving, in Gorbachev's case, it came from, within the system. Rabin's case, it came from within the military. Mandela's, he had some family that adopted him, had some prestige as tribal chieftains. Valenza was a worker. It comes from a variety of factors. It is this, person and moment interaction. Or the same thing is, And that's why I try to deal with particular cases, like in the Kissinger case, Churchill. And everybody, Churchill was a fabulous leader in World War II. Folks sometimes forget about a number of his failed leaderships before that, and the fact that the British voted him out, and then the next time he served prime minister. So it's this interaction is the best I can say.
So is it sheer luck if someone emerges as a good leader once elected or appointed, or whether the person basically doesn't fulfill early promises?
No, it's luck. I think part of the rise of these people is on the basis of the leadership they provide.
I mean, once they get into that position, like prime minister, president, and so on.
Well, I mean, again, to use the Israeli example, Rabin wins the election in 1992. He had been prime minister once before and had a family scandal and had to step down and serve a different post because he was known as Mr. Security. And so there were conducive conditions. This is the end of the Cold War, and it's the U.S.-led coalition victory in the Gulf War. And things were swirling in the Middle East, right? Countries were not as confident that the Soviets, Gorbachev wasn't strictly supporting certain countries. And the message of the United States was the world was really changing. So there were some conditions that fed into his political appeal as Mr. Security, which made him stronger than he'd been in other political manifestations. He doesn't immediately go to the process. Peres is the one who's pushing this process, and Rabin's very skeptical at first. But his experience in the Intifada, which he saw how different that was than Israel's other wars. Israel's other wars were conventional military versus conventional military, and the side that has the greater conventional military wins. The War of Independence, 1973. The Intifada was a political issue. And so he could see that whatever their strengths were, it wasn't going to meet the immediate challenge. Peres played a very important role. He couldn't pull it off on his own, but he was the poet that had all the ideas. So you get a lot of factors interacting, which is why, the best I try to do is have some sort of framework there that helps us think about it.
Okay, thanks very much. This gentleman here.
It seems to me that the world has changed so much because nuclear weapons, or so much grief can be caused by so few people. And then you've got nuclear weapons, and then you've got cybersecurity, and both those things can cause a lot of grief without very many people. So what happens when you get a small group of people with an impulsive leader? How much risk is that? I don't think we have a risk for World War III, but it seems to me we have these catastrophic risks for small groups who have some strong belief.
Yeah, I think on nuclear, sure, I mean, it's part of the impulsiveness of our president when it comes to the possession of nuclear weapons. Most of the concerns about terrorism and WMD is not about nuclear weapons. They're pretty complicated. Maybe it's more chemical and biological, which are not, they're pretty severe, but they're not severe. But that's where I think you come into the situations of global pandemics is one of the ones that worries me, because leaving aside biological terrorism, those things happen unintentionally, right? A bird carries something in its flight, or a shipment of produce or chickens coming in from somewhere. And the figures that have been, from public health specialists of what's the H1N1, what it could have been, or the avian flu, they're staggering. We had the Spanish flu, so-called, at the end of World War I, in which the percentage of the American population that fell 1919 and 1921 was huge. So I actually worry about those as well. It's not just about the terrorist and that sort of thing. But I think that there's a risk of nuclear weapons. There's also, the Cold War has demonstrated, that the possession of nuclear weapons also can give pause to leaders in terms of looking for, accommodation, as happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis and other cases. Again, you worry about leaders that wouldn't see that way. I mean, supposedly Defense Secretary Mattis says that's kind of why he's hanging around, to try to, prevent that. But so I would take it to some of these other areas as well, like global pandemics. I worry a lot about that.
And cybersecurity.
Cybersecurity is a crucial issue. We could, we know, and that's not just about governments. It's about, free agent hackers who are not say doing it for terrorism, but doing it, there's a lot of issues out there, which is why I said at the beginning, it's an area that needs rules of the game.
Thank you very much. Yes, the gentleman here. There's a cap.
Thank you for your time. You mentioned...
First of all, I like your hat. You can ask me anything you want.
You mentioned we need something more than incremental change and transactional as well. How do we apply that to peace in the Middle East? How do we go about untying the ethnic and historical Gordian knot without those procedures, and especially when it's known that cooperation can sometimes be notoriously difficult in that area?
So there, you know, if we walked out of here and we were told that the Israelis and Palestinians had signed a full peace agreement, that would be a crucial part of it. But we know the Middle East has a lot of other, you know, lines of conflict. So, you know, I can't totally. But let me talk about the, you know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict. Progress that was made, you know, in the 90s under the Oslo Agreement, and then a whole variety of things that came into play. Israel and Jordan signed a peace treaty. A number of Arab countries began diplomatic relations, some officially, some quietly, with Israel. The Israelis and the Palestinians started working together, had a whole series of agreements. And then Rabin gets assassinated. And there was terrorism on both sides. Sort of like my Northern Ireland figures. If you look at the figures, when the agreements are signed in September 93, terrorism goes up. You know, academics call that the spoilers issue. And, you know, people that are against peace on both sides, when the train's leaving the station for peace, they try to blow up the train. By late 1994-95, for Israelis, the terrorism was actually going down. But Rabin had these, you know, right-wing groups calling him Hitler and everything, and he's killed by an extremist. I asked his daughter, who I worked with, and she was a deputy minister of defense, in one of my interviews with her, if she thought if her father lived, and I talk about this in the book, would they have achieved the full Oslo Agreement, an independent Palestinian state, and, you know, security for Israel. And she said, you know, by the time he was killed, he was a little frustrated with dealing with Arafat. But their relationship was still working, and they were. And then at a very personal level, and you know, I have a very mixed view of Arafat, you know, but that relationship was really crucial. Peres wasn't capable of that, and a year later he loses to Netanyahu. And then Arafat starts to make his own decisions about why he's less interested in peace. But when Rabin's assassinated, Arafat was not allowed to come to the funeral. But he came in quietly into the country and paid what they call a shiva call on Mrs. Rabin. And what Dahlia Rabin said, she says, I think that they would have worked it out, because her father still had credibility. That was a huge missed opportunity. 20 years later, it's that much harder. There's all sorts of ideas out there, so-called one-state solution. And one version of that, some people in Palestinian like, let's just have democratic elections and everybody, and we're the majority. And some of the Israeli side like, yeah, let's just get one state and dominate that, you'll be right. Neither of those deserves the word solution. The only possible solution is a two-state solution. And it is infinitely harder now, even separate from what Trump has done, than it was. So I believe it's doable. I believe it's in the interest of both peoples. The politics on both sides have gotten really harder. So I'm not going to, bet my next mortgage payment that it's going to happen. But it is what has to happen. The other issues, there are a whole lot of issues, the Sunni-Shia issues and the repressive, so that the Middle East conflict has become multiple conflicts rolled into one region.
Thank you very much. Let me get this gentleman there, yeah?
So this past week, we've had the UN meeting where a lot of the American news has been dominated around the reaction of President Trump's reaction by UN members. I remember also that the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, made an impassioned speech about how states should look towards multilateral agreements, multilateral movements, and look towards international institutions. Now, in this day and age, you're seeing a lot of international institutions break apart, like the EU, and I was wondering, how do you think the UN can make an impact? Because you did speak about that.
Yeah, good question. The UN has a lot of its own problems that it's made for itself. But at the same time, it also has a lot of success. And people talk about UN peacekeeping, and what you get is some missions have actually been pretty successful, right? And others haven't. So why, and what can you learn from them? And some of those that haven't have failed because we've asked the UN to do something that it's not given any resources to do. So is it really the UN's fault or the countries that control the resources? I said before, the world, the US, Russia, China, others in the world need the UN to do what only the UN can do. Yet we're not letting it do it because all these countries, the Chinese say you can't be with the Dalai Lama, and the Russians say you can't talk about Ukraine, and we say you can't tell us what to do. And it sort of plays in everybody's politics. And my argument that you lose more from that than you gain. In the book, I talk only about this role of the Secretary General and how it's a necessary but not sufficient part of a more effective UN. And there are other studies that have been done about what else needs to be done in the UN. But I think, we need a global institution. Some is actually done by regional organizations. The African Union is actually doing some things in Africa that have been quite helpful. It has some problems, but just in the paper the other day, the Organization of American States, 5 countries, are bringing suit against Maduro in Venezuela. Bringing to the International Criminal Court, the sponsorship of the OIS. So you have a lot of versions of multilateralism out there. We in the United States, this whole thing, sovereignty, we want, it's counterproductive, but you can understand how you can write it into political speeches. And the current National Security Advisor is an extreme version of that. He really is. I mean, he's more extreme than most. And, part of me thinks he'd be more than happy to see the Iran relationship blow up literally and figuratively, and the North Korea. But, we'll see. Okay.
Back to the 1950s, you say?
Back to what?
To the 1950s?
In what respect?
Well, sovereignty, that is what's it's the future, then, economically going back to the coal and steel industries, also old industries whose future is probably behind them, and so on.
Yeah, the whole debate about sovereignty, and again, it comes from other directions too. One of the things Kofi Annan did, and he was, in many ways, a good, strong Secretary General, in many ways, not as good as Hammarskjöld, was the notion that sovereignty brings rights for states, but also responsibilities. And states need to fulfill those responsibilities in ways that are not telling them how to run things, but when the things they do inside their country affect others outside their country. And we have to come to grips with that. Otherwise, again, I'm sort of saying 2 different things. One is what we need to do, and the other is, less likelihood that it'll be done. But it's really crucial because the world is interconnected, right? So, whether globalization is good or bad economically, the fact is we're interconnected in every sense. People flows out of Venezuela into Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, out of North Africa, out of Syria, out of Western Africa. And to think about, we're each sovereign in a world in which things are interconnected, climate, etc., doesn't make a lot of sense.
Thank you. The gentleman here.
Trying to bring ties.
I think this comes under your categories of people and their evolution or leaders. To what degree did at least some of these emerge as leaders and make the changes that you talked about? Was it because either they had or they developed the ability to look at the world through the eyes of their interlocutor, their antagonist?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that's the evolution. So when Mandela gets out of jail, the Afrikaner community was scared and stiff, and people might say the Invictus movie with Matt Damon, and some of that, but there was a lot, and so really, a guy had been in jail for 27 years to choose, reconciliation over retribution is a pretty amazing choice. The Mandela of 1964 might have made a different choice. So he evolved as a person. There's stories I tell in the book about some of the white Afrikaner officials that he actually had started to deal with while he was in jail. My good friend and colleague, who was a professor at Duke for a number of years, Jim Joseph, was the U.S. ambassador to South Africa in the Mandela years. Not a career person, he was leader of the African-American leader of the Civil Rights Movement. And when I talked to Jim, just as a friend, but also for the book, he'd say, a lot of people are myths, you meet them, because then his went up. Rabin, the same thing, but some of it is self-interest, too. So in Rabin's case, in some ways, the most important thing to him in the Israeli context was the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. That's where he'd spent his whole career. He deeply believed in it as an institution. And one of the things he saw in the Intifada was what it was doing to the IDF. He, as defense minister, was asking young soldiers to do. And that wasn't, and he was afraid it was going to destroy the morale. So in the same way of seeing what it was from the Palestinian point of view, there was a self-interest motivation too. So I don't know that it becomes an altruism. I think when you combine walking in somebody else's shoes with some sense of what your interest is, you get a kind of a nice combination.
Thank you. You had a question, yeah?
So which figure do you most regret leaving out of this book?
So that's great. So I really wanted to debunk Pablo because the contrast between him and Valenza, roughly achieving the same thing, yet very differently, showed an interesting story of different leadership, even though both of their goals was to, de-Sovietize the country. So I'm going to Europe next week, and when I've given talks in Europe, I get hammered for leaving out a lot of European, particularly the founders of the European Union. And I started to have a chapter on Monnet, Schuman, and Adenauer together. And I really wanted to write it to say that whatever else happened with the European Union, you know better than I. The fact that we, didn't have another major war after 2 world wars is a real big deal. But again, I wasn't able to. We had a, kind of got. If you want to do a university press, keep adding chapters. If you want to do, Norton commercial press. So I really believe in that international institution section, I wanted to have the European Union chapter. They could also talk about where it was successful and where it wasn't. I also had a chapter going on Sadat, and I wanted to have the Sadat and the Rabin. So those I had to leave out.
There's always volume 2.
Yeah, right. That's good. And I started on the sustainability chapter on Al Gore, but he'd been my boss and a friend, and I just felt a conflict of interest writing that, including if I was critical, I'm not sure he would have been happy with me, but I didn't want to be non-critical as a scholar. So that was an idea. I never did that chapter.
Easy way out, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. What I notice is that we miss female voices here who ask questions. Please. Anyone who would like to volunteer? There's a few minutes left before we have to finish the evening.
I'll speak in a high voice.
Yes, please.
Considering our current president has created quite a bit of chaos, turmoils in this country, also around the world, do you predict that when the next election comes, there will be a leader, a peacemaker out of Democratic Party or Republican parties?
It's got to be better than this. But, this was a comment made to me by actually a European colleague and friend when Americans were coming over and saying, look, we'll get over this, we'll find our equilibrium point again. And he said, okay, make sure I understand your politics. In 2000, you have an election that's going to the Supreme Court, to be decided. In 2003, your president makes a decision to go to war that most of the world opposed. In 2008, you swing way to the other extreme and you elect an African-American president. And in 2016, you swing to another extreme and elect this guy Trump president. Should I expect that over the next, not just next election, but 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years, think of like a currency fluctuation that you're going to stay within the band? I can't reassure on that question. I think we're in this situation, which is part of what I was talking about earlier, about the ways in which Trump is effect, not just cause, and Europe is too, by the way. I think we're not going to just, and I also think we have to figure out what our global role is, and it is different than it was, in the Cold War liberal order. So it's going to be a rocky ride.
Maybe we should allow foreigners to stand for president.
Want Melania to be president?
Yeah. We can do a better job than what is being done right now, I'm sure. Right, thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you very much, Bruce Johnson, for a very stimulating talk and for answering all our questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
And thank you all. And on Tuesday we have Ambassador Christopher Hill, the former lead negotiator for the US on North Korea. So that should also be an interesting talk. Please come back at 5:30 in this very room. That is on Tuesday already. And see you then. Okay, thanks for coming. Bye-bye.